Welcome to the Development Book Club. Today we continue with Restoring Sanctuary, specifically this chapter, which is the second sanctuary commitment, which is the commitment to democracy. First little section here is called Deep Democracy in the Sanctuary Model. And of course, because they're awesome, they begin with a definition. Democracy, quote, the ideal of a cohesive community of people living and working together and finding fair, nonviolent ways to reconcile conflicts. Point here is that democracy is not that everyone votes on everything. Voting is a part of democracy, but it's not all of it, obviously. And today, we always assume that certain behaviors, like voting, for example, when we think of democracy, and it's not, but we think it should be awareness that is necessary if abuses of power are to be checked. There's a certain awareness that's going on, not just behaviors. Deep democracy here refers to a change in this awareness, not just people's behaviors, an awareness of voices that are both central to projects and on the margins, because everything is interconnected in these systems that we live and work in. And they make a good point, which says that a major hazard of so-called having power is that people don't tell you the truth. And to be effective as a leader, you need people to tell you when you're naked, inadequate, stupid, out of control, or whatever, when you are that. Most U.S. citizens do not even question the fact that they are required to check their voices at the door in their workplace. So the question is here, why have organizational democracy? And a good counterpoint the authors bring up is that if tasks are repetitive and technical, democracy can be counterproductive so for an assembly line, for example. But if there is a constant adaptability to changing conditions and flexibility needed, and morale and creative thought play significant roles in determining success or failure of a project, then democracy is needed, or the people are needed, their voices, their inputs. So employees who feel secure only when they are told exactly what to do may find the demands of democratic participation very anxiety-provoking, obviously. And these people may seek employment elsewhere once sanctuary practices or a commitment to deep democracy is instituted, just to be aware of that. Next sort of section is democracy is minimizing the abuse of power. That's the point of democracy, to minimize the abuse of power. So the more democratic a nation, for example, is, the less severe its overall foreign violence, the less likely it will be to have domestic collective violence going on in the country, and the less likely it is to kill its own people. The authors here, they show us how all of the sanctuary commitments are actually intertwined and tie into each other. So democracy works well with nonviolence, for example, even in all forms, overt and veiled. And so a cool counterpoint that they're very aware of what's going on is that it's not difficult for a whole group to come to a decision that appears or technically is democratic, but is this is the great quote, an emotionally dim-witted decision. Unquote, when we pause to examine where the consequences of the decision are likely to lead. So we can all agree on something dumb, and that doesn't necessarily make it a good thing while it may be democratic. So here, the commitment to growth and change and the commitment to emotional intelligence serve as a check to the commitment to democracy. And the sort of an image is given here of the sanctuary commitments as a juggling act. We're always sort of juggling these 7 balls in the air. People support what they have had a hand in creating. So big. This is another point of democracy. They say if you let them plan the fight, they don't fight the plan. Managers need to manage in a different way as well, because the main role of a leader is to create the improvisational space within which creative responses are more likely to occur, to come up. Such democratic leaders do not run the show, but they are actively involved in the creative process. There's an amazing point about post-traumatic stress disorder in veterans with respect to democracy. It's a small tangent, but it's in the book, and I wanted to read this to you. It's really insightful. And this comes from Jonathan Shea, his book, The Birth of Tragedy, a little nod to Nietzsche. But he works in post-traumatic stress disorder with veterans. And speaking of democracy, he says, unhealed combat trauma disables the basic social and cognitive capacities required for democratic participation. Being able to show up at an appointed place, possibly in a crowd of strangers, being able to experience words as trustworthy, and seeing the possibility of persuasion, negotiation, compromise, and concession So seeing the possibility of winning without killing, of losing without dying, and seeing the future as real and meaningful. All those capacities are taken down, if not eliminated, in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And those very categories or qualities are needed for a functioning democracy. It's funny because that's what they're fighting for, right? Democracy. And then they end up losing the very capacity for the thing for which they fought. And of course, how we do or don't treat them when they return. Back to the book. The greater the involvement of the clients in creating more democratic environments, the more likely they are to have experiences through any typical day that are directly counter to many of the habits they've already developed. So it's also important to involve our clients when appropriate in the democratic process. And not just with behavior, but with the awareness piece, right? The importance of involving family. Part of practicing democratically means engaging all stakeholders in ongoing collaborative processes. So this is like clinically appropriate too, right? To involve the family as a system. And so here's the implications for democratic leadership. Then we'll talk about the sanctuary toolkit and we're done for the day. Discernment. Key word here is carefully listening to group members' ideas and values and tentatively attempting to identify the public voice of the solution that best represents the group's collective interests. So the authors also set up a democratic leader as a nice midpoint between an authoritarian leader and a laissez-faire leader. And there's a whole bunch of examples. I selected just 3. So where the authoritarian leader is empowered by the office or the position they hold, and the laissez-faire leader minimizes their own personal influence. The democratic leader in the middle, they don't use their position to influence the group. The authoritarian may hold power through personal charisma. Laissez-faire expects to be liked for leaving people alone. And the democratic leader exercises discernment and self-awareness. Authoritarians expect unquestioning obedience. Laissez-faire managers or people minimize relationships. And in the middle, the democrats are relationally transparent with their team. So in making the transition to democratic participation, reenactment can rear its head, which we spoke about last time, in the form of managers who subtly limit information available to decision-making teams. So we need to be aware of this. Again, the abuse of power. Ineffective leaders are likely to employ only one dominant style and use that style in all situations, which is not correct. Sanctuary toolkit for democracy is, number 1, or there are 3 or 4 things. The community meeting, which is a deliberate, repetitive transition ritual intended to psychologically move people from some activity that they've been doing into a new group psychological space, preparing the way for collective thought and action. 4 questions here. Who are you for the new people? What are you feeling? What is your goal for today? And who can you ask for help? Second tool in the toolkit here is our team meetings. One of us is as smart as not as smart as all of us is the idea here. So in the team meetings, we can address client issues, gather ideas for working with individual clients, discuss new initiatives to improve the activities or events coming on the horizon. Team meetings should have clear goals, a clear agenda available in advance, and be held in a predictable time and place, and each staff can put items on the agenda, and perhaps even the clients I would add that, even though they don't say that in the book. In those meetings, we should always follow up on last time and keep minutes and relay those minutes. And there's a safe level system, so there's like a SAFE, different levels of current behavior, and this should be tied to a treatment plan and increasing levels of privilege, and focus on rewarding kids or clients for their therapeutic gains, not punishing them for their indiscretions. So this will have like treatment goals, behavioral expectations, rewards, consequences, and transitions. That is it for the commitment to democracy. Check out next time when we continue with the sanctuary commitments.